All right, all right. Welcome back to Table Talk, everyone. I'm your host, Yvette Gallinar. Thank you for tuning in. We have a very special episode today because I am joined by not one, but two first-time guests. And let me tell you a little bit about them today for those of you that might not know who they are. And I'd like to give them a proper introduction. So I'm going to read off the bios right here, if you don't mind, real quick. And let's start with known as the maverick of archaeologists. We have Dr. Aaron Judkins. He is a biblical archaeologist, a flight medic. I didn't know that actually. A flight medic. He is an author and film producer, and he's known for the documentary theatrical film Finding Noah. He holds a Master of Arts in Biblical Studies from Pacific International University and a PhD in Biblical Archaeology from Bible Believers Christian College and Seminary in 2009. And some of his excavation projects include the Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem, the search for Noah's Ark, and the discovery of Dead Sea Scroll Cave 12 in Qumran, Israel. I've discussed the Dead Sea Scrolls here before with Josh Peck, which is very interesting. He also has mapped the longest contiguous dinosaur trackway in North America in Glen Rose, Texas, and solved the Los Lunas Mystery Stone in New Mexico. I'd love to pick your brain on all of that, by the way. So that would be like a 5 hour long episode, I'm sure. And then we also have Dr. Judd Burton, who you see here as well. And he is an ancient historian, anthropologist, and archaeologist, specializing in the history of religions with a focus on early Christianity and Greco-Roman religion. He completed his BA in history in 1999 at Hardin Simmons University in Abilene, and a PhD in history from Texas Tech in 2010. He's an avid explorer and researcher and has been part of a number of archaeological and historical expeditions. They are both the authors of this book that I'm holding right here, Decoding Gobekli Tepe, Biblical Anatolia and The Watchers. Guys, welcome to Table Talk. I am so honored to have you on. Thank you for accepting my invite.
Hey, thank you for having us on. We're really
Yes,
excited to be on the show.
thanks for having us.
I appreciate you guys so much. I appreciate your time, truly. But like I mentioned just a little bit ago, I'm in the middle of reading this and I'm taking my time because as I take down notes, highlight, and underline a bunch of stuff, I mentioned to you guys off camera that my husband and I are going to be going on a trip to Turkey in June this year. And I can't begin to tell you how excited I am to go on that trip. But one of the things we're going to be doing, we're going to visit the landing site of Noah's Ark, and we're also going to be visiting Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. So this book, as God would have it, I think that he took this little girl from South Florida, the Miami area, and said, "You have interest in this. Let me put it all together for you." And this book came right on time because it is a blessing so that I can kind of excavate this before my trip. So I appreciate you guys writing about it. And the
Yeah.
timing is just perfect, perfect. But I wanted to ask you guys, why did you decide to write a book about this specific archaeological site? I mean, there are tons and tons out there, thousands, right? Why Gobekli Tepe? Why this site?
I um I had a follower in Canada. His name's Roger. He's followed my work for a number of years, and Roger reached out to me several times, probably back in 2016, 2017,
Mhm.
sometime in there, and asked me to take a look at Gobekli Tepe. He wanted to know what I thought about it, and I said, well, it's just some stones that have some animal motifs or artistic in nature. Is probably related to Noah's Ark because it's in that region, and
Yeah.
but I didn't really know anything about it. And he said, "Hey, have you ever considered really looking into this and writing a book on it?" I said, "No, I was flying full time on the helicopter.
Hmm.
Uh, you're working 24-hour shifts, you're on duty 24-hour shifts. And so my time was very limited, and that's, you know, so I didn't really have a lot of time to look into it. And then after about the third or fourth time, Roger said, "Look, Aaron, take another look at this because there's something else going on here. Would you seriously take a look at it?" And he said, "If you decide that there's more to it, and if you want to write a book about it," he said, I think you should." And so he just kept encouraging me. And so as I began to take more further in-depth look at it, as a matter of fact, I had a guy that I did a radio show with, and he said he sent me a picture of the two central stones in enclosure D that we'll talk about. And he
Hmm.
said, "It looks like there's a belt around these stones, you know." And I said, "That's not a belt. It looks like a belt, but it's not a belt." And so I just quickly dismissed it. Well, when I went back after Rogers prompted me for several times, I got to taking another look at that, and I thought those are belts, and they're anthropomorphic in nature. These stones are anthropomorphic, which means they have a human likeness to them, with arms and hands, and they were indeed wearing a belt. And so that really boggled my mind because these two central T-stone pillars in enclosure D are 18 and a half foot tall. And so that blew my mind. I wasn't aware of this. And so when I started really digging into it, I said, "There's something here that's 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 there's something more to this than what I had realized."
Right.
And so I reached out to Dr. Burton and I said, "Hey, buddy, would you be willing to co-write a book with me on this? Because I think there's something I want to get into." So this started us both on a journey that's taken us about 5 years now.
5 years. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll never forget when Aaron called me. I was drinking a cup of coffee and sitting in my truck. I was living in McAllen, Texas at the time, and I was teach had was just about to finish up my time at South Texas College before I devoted all my time to the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. But by that time, I had been teaching about Gobekli Tepe in my first in my anthropology and archaeology classes when I was teaching at West Texas A&M, and then in my world civilization classes when I became a professor at South Texas College. But prehistory had made a good quarter of the material that I was talking about in my world civ and ancient classes, simply because late prehistory was so crucial to understanding the emergence of city-state dwelling. And so I've been keeping track of what was going on at Gobekli Tepe for over a decade at that point, and had didn't quite know what to do in terms of research. But I really knew that at that point in time, nobody was really looking at it through the lens of the Bible.
Right.
For all the good work that Klaus Schmidt and all the other archaeologists had done, um, there's not any there's really nothing um, there's really nothing substantial in terms of biblical scholarship that's been done on the site. So I knew that when Aaron called me, I knew that was God tapping us on the shoulder to take not only a closer look at the site, but what its potential implications for biblical studies might be, especially considering how important ancient Anatolia, ancient Turkey, is to the Bible. A lot of times
Mhm.
it's almost treated like a peripheral subject, but there's so much going on
Yeah.
in both prehistoric and ancient Anatolia that's relevant to the biblical narrative from the beginning of the Old Testament until the last book in the New Testament. And so, yeah, Aaron and I have been working and thinking on this for quite some time.
I love it. I absolutely love that you can take a site like Gobekli Tepe. And by the way, is it Gobekli Tepe or Tepe?
Either
Does it
either
matter?
one. I've heard people pronounce it and mispronounce it so many times, but yeah, Gobekli Tepe or Tepe, either one.
Okay. Yeah, I've always said Tepe, and I heard somebody the other day on a documentary that I was watching said Tepe, and I thought, well, okay, I'll call it Tepe, I guess. So
Mhm.
I was wondering, but how you can, I know we talked about this before, how you can connect those dots with biblical history, and do you guys think that there are other sites that also correspond with the Bible, or not, not a lot of these ancient sites, or do you think all of the ancient sites?
Judd, go ahead and take that one.
I think that are you talking about just in the vicinity of Göbekli Tepe or in ancient Turkey in general?
In ancient Turkey in general,
Oh my goodness, yeah,
right?
from every quarter of the place, from the easternmost reaches, where Aaron was on that expedition to locate evidence for the Ark,
Mm-hmm.
to the west coast. Th this is a region that's of the world that's yielding new archaeological finds almost weekly. There's a lot going on in Turkey, but yeah, there are plenty of other sites. I mean, the Şanlıurfa, which is the city that's closest to modern city that's closest to Göbekli Tepe, is one of the candidates for Abraham's Ur. We know that Abraham was from this region of Turkey, Haran.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And so, in a very fundamental way, you've got the nation of Israel actually springing from ancient Anatolia, prehistoric Anatolia. Uh, the the Garden of Eden is likely located here, the region of Eden, um, and of course, there's interaction with the cultures of ancient Anatolia and ancient Israel. This is events throughout the Old Testament, and then by the time you get to the New Testament, of course, there's a lot of early Christian history and church work that's being done. Um, Paul, the apostle, was from ancient Anatolia. So there are sites that are both known and I suspect findings that we have yet to uncover that have great relevance to the biblical narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And Göbekli Tepe just happens to be in Abraham's backyard and in close vicinity to uh, the region of Eden.
Now, am I correct in thinking that they're wanting to close the site, or have they closed the site because they don't want to have any more um, excavations, or is that still
They have
ongoing?
not closed the site. No.
Okay.
Um, there is I think there's reports that the archaeologist there, which is the German Institute of Archaeology, um, who's been digging at the site for a number of years, um, have slowed down excavations,
Okay.
but I don't think that they fully stopped them. As a matter of fact, that came from the director of the excavations on an update that they put out on YouTube months ago. But he said that they were continuing excavations. So um, I think that they have they have excavated uh, a lot of material there, but it's part of archaeology is you have to publish, and so they have to take time to sift all this material, but they also have to put it down on paper and write a report about it, and so sometimes information coming out of Gobekli Tepe is slow. And sometimes it's a couple of years after the fact that they found something that the public's even aware of it.
Oh, wow.
So, for instance, it took about 10 years alone just to excavate enclosure D.
Okay.
So this is a huge 20-acre site, and there's probably at least 20 other enclosures that are buried under Gobekli Tepe and that they have not even excavated. So at the current rate of excavations, that'd take them about 150 years to fully excavate the 20-acre site.
Wow.
Now, I don't think that they're going to ever fully excavate it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but um, but I think what we do know is that, and according to the research that Judd has done in this book, this really gives an answer, like Judd said, for the first time through a biblical lens of historicity of where do you put Gobekli Tepe. So we try to
Yes.
answer who the people were, why they were there, and what they were doing.
Yeah, and that's what I find fascinating as I'm continuing to read it. What do the Watchers have to do with Gobekli Tepe? I think you go into that a little bit, don't you, in the book?
Yeah, Judd gets into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the well, the thinking here is that a lot of people in your audience are probably familiar with the Genesis 6 story and
Yeah.
some of the Second Temple period apocryphal literature that comments on it, like the book, notably the Book of Enoch,
Mm-hmm.
in which the Watchers are featured prominently. They're actually it identifies the Benach Elohim as Watcher class angels, um, and so it might not seem like that would have a direct um, a direct bearing on a site like Göbekli Tepe. However, um, as Aaron and I were thinking about some of the issues at stake at Göbekli Tepe, um, for again, for whether people subscribe to old Earth or young Earth chronology, for much of human history, humans have been hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists. And during the window of that is the archaeological horizon in which Göbekli Tepe and other sites like it, like Novali Chari and Karahan Tepe, when they emerge, um, they're they do so at almost a 90-degree angle change in cultural trajectory because there's stratification of society and division of labor and organized politics and religion, all of the hallmarks of later city-state dwelling cultures like the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the Harappans, but much farther back in the archaeological timeline. Um, I don't subscribe to everything that he believes, but I think that Jared Diamond's thesis in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel had some applicability here. In essence, what he does is um, he looks at uh, well, his book Guns, Germs, and Steel is a world history. I don't want to ruminate on this for too long, but the relevance in the illustration will become clear. What he does is he examines how the things like geography and epidemiology and metallurgy and all of these factors that were set up thousands of years before Europeans met Native Americans in the Americas, like the continents in the old world, Europe and Asia were long east to west, and so ideas in metallurgy and agriculture traveled more easily. They had herd animals in the old world, and so generations upon generations were kind of inoculated against things like smallpox and anthrax, although not universally. And then, of course, the technology was able to travel. So these all of these things were set up millennia before, let's say Pizarro, met Atahualpa, the Incan king in South America in the 1530s. But it had drastic ramifications for native society in the Americas because it was never the same. Not just the not just the militaristic conquest, but the sort of unconscious biological warfare
Mm.
that was going on. The smallpox was especially virulent. So, what in the world does all this have to do with Gobekli Tepe and the Watchers? Well, the precedent in human history for this kind of cultural change that takes place at Gobekli Tepe is only possible when there is a far superior, um, technologically, culturally advanced society uh, that directly influences another society.
Okay.
As I said, all you have on the planet in this archaeological horizon is basically horticulturalists and hunter-gatherers in large part. So where is the agency of change? You can't find that agency amongst other human populations when Gobekli Tepe emerges. You have to look for a supernatural explanation because there is no other cultural influence that could have done this.
Yeah.
Uh, Again, that's the clash between the Americas and the old world is sort of Diamond's uh, climax of the book. But there are any number of other examples of these sorts of cultural clashes that take place. My point being, again, is that you can't find that agency of change for Göbekli Tepe and the other city states that emerge in the Mesolithic and the early Neolithic. You're just not going to find it in other human populations, but because they all share a very similar lifestyle. And so that's why we've turned to looking at the Watchers as this agent of cultural change. And the reason that fits so nicely is because, as I've told my students for years, Göbekli Tepe is the paradigm that shatters the paradigm. Not only is it this example of earlier city-state dwelling, but it it's not this sort of social organization doesn't come about in the same way that scholars have thought in the past about city states, that agriculture was necessary in order for cities to emerge. Well, it's actually religion at
Mm.
Göbekli Tepe that draws everyone to the site to actually build these structures in the first place. And centralized organization, politics, um, agriculture,
Hmm.
herding, all of that is epiphenomenal of the initial presence at Göbekli Tepe, which is one of worship.
Yeah.
And at least in uh, part of that worship was directed towards the Watchers themselves as
Mm.
they set themselves up as the subjugators and rulers of humanity during this period.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I know that you talk a lot about how worship is one of the centralized themes when it comes to, the site. And there's this commonality when it comes to, some of these historical areas, for example, the, Stonehenges and in the way that the stones are situated, the size of them, the facing the sun, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But so besides worshiping the sun, for example, what are other kinds of rituals that are connected to the site itself? I mean, I was reading something that actually struck my curiosity, which I never really thought of before, and that was the I think it was in chapter 3 that you mentioned about ancestor worship, and which obviously is a practice that dates back to Roman and Greek antiquity. And um interestingly enough, you mentioned about the faith and the native faith in Japan, I think. Uh, you mentioned that, and obviously Central and South America cultures was also a practice of ancestor worship. But what I found interesting too is you mentioned how the actual stone is, or stones are believed to be, um, oh, for lack of a better word, like uh, possessions, if you will, of these ancestors, or their ancestral worship, that they worship the stones. Can you just elaborate a little bit about that? I know that you go into the Navali Kori section and all of that. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. To your first question was there, what other worship was happening in the area?
Yeah.
And, as Judd pointed out earlier, he talked about modern day Shanlurfa. This is the biblical site of Edessa that talks about, or the biblical site of Ur.
Right.
And we know in this area that they had worshipped the moon god,
Mm.
not only but it's prevalent throughout the region, at neighboring sites around Gobekli Tepe called Karahan Tepe. Um, Sefer Tepe is another site where they worship the moon god. Sagmatar would be another one. And there's often, um, at some of these sites, there's often an iconography of the crescent moon, that has been deified with the images of two people on either side in reverence to this moon god. It's usually two males, um, but even in the biblical city of Jericho, which is a Neolithic site, it's probably contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe. They worship the moon god, and we see that Abraham, when he lived in this area of, in Ur, which is along the ancient plains of Haran, and he's called out of this area after his father dies. His father was named Terah. Terah worshipped the moon god. Um, but God calls Abraham out of this area
Mm.
when his father dies at about, Abraham is 75. His name was Abram. He was
Mhm.
75, and God calls him out of this area. Why? I think because this was a spiritual stronghold to the moon god that they had worshipped there, and God's calling him out to become a separate nation. So this is part of the spiritual concepts that we get into in the book, the cosmology that we look at in ancient Mesopotamia. So specifically, they had deified the moon, but they had also deified the image of the bull. And we know that the people of the Neolithic were known as people of the bull. We see this at other sites, such as Chattahoochee, where this is in the standard chronology. It's past Göbekli Tepe, um, but about 10,000 people lived at Chattahoochee, and we know uh, that they probably took down some of these big giant auroch bulls that stood about 9 foot at the shoulder. They were very powerful creatures, but um, if you took one of them down, that provided a lot of meat for your family and for the community.
Mhm.
So they deified the image of the moon. We know that because we find that they took their skulls and they placed them in their homes.
Hmm.
And we found three or four or five of these bullcranium skulls with the horns in the homes of where the people lived. And oftentimes they would plaster the skulls to strengthen the bones, and if they were disintegrated, to keep them, um, in better condition. And so we see that there's veneration of this, but they also, you're right, they also venerated their ancestors. Derek Gilbert wrote a book called Veneration,
Mhm.
and it gives us an historical marker to about 2000 BC of exactly that ancient cultures were venerating their ancestors. So it's not a new practice. And I think the people at Gobekli Tepe were venerating their ancestors, but more specifically, they had deified the two central images in enclosure D as Adam and Eve. And they have deified their two original ancestors, one on pillar um, 18 with the image of the crescent moon where the neck is. So no face, but they're anthropomorphic, which means they're human-like. So no face, but they have arms, hands come to the navel. They are wearing that belt, and they're wearing fox pelt loincloths. Now,
Mm.
why do stones need to wear fox pelt loincloths? This is very odd. They're 18 and a half foot tall, remember, but central pillar 18 has the image of the crescent moon. I think the full moon disk above that, and then another symbol that we could talk about later. But I identified that pillar as the deification of Eve. And then Western Pillar 31, which is what I just talked about, this iconography of the bull with the skull and the horns, is the one we see on that pillar, where about where the neck would be. And this is the deification of the bull god. And so when we put these two together, they have deified their original ancestors, Adam and Eve.
Wow. That is wild to me,
Yeah. And not only that, we're suggesting that in a new theory called the regeneration theory,
right?
that that see they had the it when the ancients lost their connection with God in the Garden of Eden, death suddenly came on them.
Hmm.
That was not supposed to happen in the Garden of Eden. Death wasn't supposed to happen. Adam and Eve was supposed to
Yeah.
have lived in that, forever,
Hmm.
in that physical, form. But when sin entered, that all changed, and the scripture says that the creation groans because of it. Then we have the introduction of the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law of entropy. So things doesn't get better, things get worse. So we age, things fall apart. It is the nature of sin upon us, and because of that, Adam and Eve died two deaths. They spiritually died that very day, and the second death was their physical death that they were going to live out and then die a physical death. And the people that came after them had this lost connection that they had lost in the Garden of Eden. And
Hmm.
so now, how do you try to establish this connection back again? And I think what has happened is that they have been led astray by the influence of the Watchers that Judd just talked about. And it talks about in the book of Enoch. While we don't use that for doctrine, it
Hmm.
can give us some historical insight into what was happening in those days, and probably some color. So in the book of Enoch, the first book, not the second or the third book, but I
Yeah.
think in the first book of Enoch, it talks about those 200 class watcher angels that descended on Mount Hermon, and it tells exactly what they were doing. So they interfered in the affairs of mankind. And when this happens, we see this cultural change, this influence that judges talked about that's happening at Gobekli Tepe, because they believe, getting back to the veneration, when you died, that you had to go through the process in the underworld where you were destroyed because of sin. So to be bound to something, if you're bound to something, it's because you usually owe a debt to that something. And the thing that bound them was death,
Mm.
which means they were bound to death, they were tied to it, and because of that, they owed a debt that they could not pay. And that debt was sin. So what happens is when they die, they have to go to the underworld. They get destroyed in the underworld. But during this process of destruction, they get reborn back through the stones, back to the stars in the heavenlies to become a deified star god. This is what the ancients believed. So when you died, they took remnants of your skulls and placed them back in the enclosure at Gobekli Tepe so that you would be reborn as a star god, just like they had deified Adam and Eve.
Mm.
And the only way to do this is through their original ancestors, Adam and Eve, because they believed that through the birth that the woman gives was held the miracle of creation because she could give birth, and this is why they deified Eve. So when you did this all goes back to Mother Earth worship, um, uh, goddess worship throughout ancient history, and then even in today, it's called Gaia worship or Mother Nature worship.
Mm-hmm.
So this all goes back to Eve. We walk it out in the book, but this is part of the regeneration theory. So that when they die, they can go back to become a star god in the heavens, but they're doing it through ulterior motives and means. And part of that is through the Watchers' influence, because now they have deified two entities. One was the moon god, and secondly was the image of the bull. And then we walk you through the book about what these two images are. They're not just a deification of Adam and Eve and the stone pillars, which they are, but they merge into a central face that the Bible talks about, which is the image of Lucifer.
Mm.
And now we see suddenly it becomes clear that the purpose of Gobekli Tepe, at least in Enclosure D, not the entire site perhaps, but in Enclosure D, is what they were doing in Enclosure D was performing these ritual, probably libation ceremonies so your ancestors could be reborn in the afterlife.
Yeah. And it's no wonder that God initially, I mean, from the get-go said, "You shall have no other gods before me," because you had all this happening, right? When he
Yeah.
calls when he calls Israel to himself, the very one of the very first things, it's "You shall have no other gods before me." And it's really interesting to see how it all emerges from just the very the very beginning. And well, God did not intend in the first place is what the enemy went ahead and twisted. And obviously we know the story. That's how we see in Genesis 3. Then we see obviously everything that went on in Genesis 6. This is such um, an interesting and very key, I think, to biblical studies site, if you will.
Yeah.
And I think that that's why it's so important to emerge some of the things that you write about in the book, right? Both of you, and how you collaborate in it. I'm going to ask a real simple question, and it might, seem very elementary, but for the sake of anybody that might be watching, I know that a lot of people have asked me with regards to the giants and the Nephilim and all of that, but do you believe that giants were part of building some of these um like Stonehenges, or some of these sites? Think about all these like stones that you're talking about, the size of them, the weight of them, is how, no matter how much I think they try to reenact people bringing those stones up to a certain place, it doesn't compute. So what do you think happened there? I mean, how were these stones? Do you think the Watchers did it, that through technology that we just have no idea what kind of technology, advanced technology they were using? Were they beings such as giants and Nephilim? Who built these things? Who brought those stones that were so heavy? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that in I think that in some cases you can make an argument for the Watchers and the Giants being involved. I don't think you can completely take human labor out of the question in all of them. I think there's a middle ground really between the two of them. We have to remember that humanity was subjugated again and again by these entities,
Yeah.
and to one degree or another, they still are today, whether by way of fallen angels and principalities, or their uh, the demons, the very spiritual residues of the tribes of giants. Um, but yeah, I mean, there are monuments that are both, arguably pre-flood and early post-flood, that baffle our engineering knowledge. And yeah, number one, I think at the end of the day, there are cases where we have to admit that we don't know that technology has been lost. And number two, there are those that stretch our understanding of engineering and physics, where you have to consider supernatural cultural influence, because this is the modus operandi of the fallen angels and the demons, is that they either create culture or they infiltrate culture and manipulate it um, to their own ends. That's been their MO since the beginning. It's certainly something I think is quantifiable at Gobekli Tepe. Um, now, the I think the overarching design and architecture of a lot of these places, these megalithic structures, uh, probably come from technology and mathematics that's not native to this dimension. In other words, it is Watcher tech,
Mm.
and yeah, it's certainly plausible that the Nephilim and other tribes of giants uh, were used as manpower essentially uh, in constructing some of these. But I think it's a combination. I think that there have been some clearly demonstrated methods that humans have used to build, gigantic structures.
Hmm.
But there are others, like the pyramids of Giza, that sort of defy the old heave ho method doesn't exactly work. There was a Japanese corporation back in the 70s that tried to replicate using, you know, bronze chisels and reed boats to transport the stones. And it was like the Keystone Cops. It was just one fail after another where they had to bring in modern equipment just to try and build a small facsimile of a pyramid, and they couldn't do it. So, at the end of the day, there are cases that we just don't know. But I think that a supernatural perspective does give us some insight into both how and perhaps more importantly why
Mm.
these structures were built. And I've said on any number of occasions, at least in the case of structures like pyramids, uh, these are mountain effigies. That's not even something that's debated in religious and historical scholarship. But I think the mountain that they are a legacy to is Mount Hermon,
Hmm.
and the events that transpired there. So yeah, there is definitely room for watcher giant variables in the equation of how megaliths were built.
Absolutely. Dr. Aaron, you were talking about some symbols too that were engraved in some of these stones. You said you were going to get back to that. You were talking about the half moon, and can
Yeah.
you pick up on that one?
Yeah, sure. So back to Eastern Pillar 18, we talked about the crescent moon, um, perhaps the full moon disk above that, which sits above it. And then right above that is what we would think of as an English letter H. It's not an H, but that's about the closest thing we can relate to with it. But this is actually a Luvian logogram. And matter of fact, there's designs on where that belt is on the side and throughout the stones, which are Luvian logograms, including the bull cranium that we talked about on Western Pillar
Mhm.
31. These are Luvian logograms. These logograms are not just artistic designs. They're this language. And another theory we're proposing in the book is that this is Anatolian hieroglyphics, which is language. So it's not just art motifs. And the iconography in this um, really goes back to the idea of what they were trying to communicate. So back in the 1800s, they had discovered this, but they had misidentified it as hieroglyphic Hittite. And it wasn't until the 1930s, we're at a neighboring site called Kara Tepe, not to be confused with Karahan Tepe, but Kara Tepe.
Mhm.
They identified Luvian logograms at that site in the 1930s. And they realized that they had mislabeled the language. It was not hieroglyphic Hittite, but it was Anatolian Anatolian hieroglyphics, but more specifically, it was a subgroup that was prominent in the Indo-European sub-language called Luwian logograms. And the logogram is a symbol represents one word. And so we see that the Luwians were neighboring uh, with the Hittites, and the Hittites adopted this language into their culture. Specifically, the logograms were used specifically for writing on monumental stone as a formal script when they wanted to memorialize a ritual or something in stone. It was done through Luwian logograms because you got a very short space on stone. You're literally putting it into stone. So you want to use a language that you're not using a lot of room. So logograms, this Anatolian hieroglyphics, is a perfect uh, language for this. And so when I picked up the Luwian logogram for Deus, which is a transliteration into Latin for God, there's one specifically that's for Deus on the stones at Gobekli Tepe, and that's look, Luwian logograms. There's just a handful of scholars throughout the world that are fluent or have any kind of expert knowledge in Luwian logogram. There's just not that many. A lot of the logograms have been deciphered, but a lot have hundreds of those logograms have not been deciphered. But one that we do know that's been deciphered and that's very clear is the symbol, the logogram for Deus, which is the one that's used at Gobekli Tepe, which means God. The H that we just talked about is a Luwian logogram that stands for gate or portal. Now, if this is logograms, and if you put this together in English, it would transliterate to the gate or the portal of the gods.
Wow.
And then you have the images of the Vulcanium, the crescent moon there. So again, I think this goes back to the regeneration theory that they are venerating their ancestors, but they're venerating these two particular deities, I think. We talk about the Anunnaki in the book and how that plays into it. But they are one, I think, that they are venerating the ancestors. They're venerating these deity gods through this symbology that when you die, you're being destroyed in the afterlife in the netherworld to be reborn into eternal life through these spiritual entities. And this is the influence of the Watchers. So when you get to the next when you get further along in the book, you'll understand that'll become clearer for you because you'll see these images morph into a single image of the original face of the cherub. And the face of the cherub, biblically, the face of the cherub is an ox. There's four faces, but the one that we're talking about is the biblical image of the ox. And so this is, I think, the very beginnings of Baal worship, perhaps. And when you see the image of Baal, you see the image of the deification of Eve along with it, which is known in ancient history as Ashtar worship or Ishtar worship, or the Lady of the Birth, or in Catholicism, they would call her the Lady, just simply the Lady.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is so what's Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. So what's happened in the very beginnings, now we see coming throughout ancient cultures, through Egyptian culture, through Greece and through Rome, and through the pervading cultures around the earth, even going to South and Central America, where you have the Aztecs and the Mayans who are building step ziggurat pyramids, but now they're performing actual human sacrifices up on these pyramids. They're cutting out your heart, sacrificing you to the god Quetzalcoatl. And so, but they have definitely venerated these gods in exchange for knowledge and in exchange for for things that were considered forbidden. And the very purpose of the Watchers was just to watch. They were supposed to watch and document. They were not supposed to cross over the barrier and interfere. And they did. There's at least 200 of them that did. perhaps even more later, but they did do that. And because Jude says that they left their first estate, which means they transformed from the celestial into a physicality, that when they died, they then died as normal men, but then their offspring they were the progenitors of the Nephilim and the Rephaim, and these were the biblical giants. And then we see in Numbers 13:33 that the sons of Anak were in the land, the Anakim. This goes back to An, which is the very God, the very beginning God in the Sumerian pantheon, which is God An, which is the sky god. So, which is the deification of Adam. So we see that this is what's happening. I think at Gobekli Tepe, and they have um, a very orchestrated effort, which brings them together because of religious ideology. Just said earlier, it's not agriculture that brought them together first; it
Yeah.
was religious ideology.
Yeah, I remember reading that in the book. That's very interesting, how you write about that. And it's not like you said, there's nothing new under the sun. We know that that's a biblical um, a reality, and you see so many religions that have stemmed through, the generations, and how there's not just ancestral worship, but there's also all kinds of different worships. You mentioned also in the book, I'm not sure if it was Dr. Judd, if you mentioned it, or Dr. Aaron, about the Japan faith as well, and how the native faith of Japan also has ancestral worship. And so this isn't like, this is nothing new, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, animism and ancestral worship and totemism, to one degree or another, can be seen at places like Gobekli Tepe. But these are some of the oldest examples that we have of this interference from not just Watchers, but the Nephilim and the Rephaim too. Um, is the deification of ancestors and just really all kinds of spirits in general. I mentioned totemism being the reverence of and deification or reverence of animal spirits, essentially. Um, but what's interesting about um, I know Aaron talks about the Shinto traditions of animism and ancestor worship you find in Japan, but again, you can spin the globe and find these sorts of traditions in most, well, I say most, but a lot of the world religions, and in particular, a lot of indigenous traditions. Um,
Yeah.
but the interesting changes that are taking place at Gobekli Tepe is this idea of not just uh, not just deification of ancestors and spirits, but the these people's gods are actually taking physical form and they're interacting
Yeah.
with them. Um,
And you see a lot of these uh, petroglyphs, or I don't know if you call them that. I'm not an archaeologist, but you guys are. But you see all sorts of like weird looking animals. You mentioned animal worship, and the very strange looking, almost um, you know, with a different head and different bodies and human heads, and animalistic bodies. And it's, you look at that and you go, what in the world? And how does this even connect to the Bible, right?
Well, the Bible does talk about chimeric beings. Um, we know that there's, in the ancient mythologies, there's the idea of the griffins and the centaurs,
Yeah.
the sphinxes. I talk a little bit about the sphinx in the book. Um, uh, unicorns, things like this. So yeah, there was, that time was so much different than this time. It's like if you sat down and read the book The Lord of the Rings for the first time, or when you watched the movie for the first time, if you could spiritualize that movie or the book, um, and you think back to the Old Testament, back in those days, in the days of Jared, when these watchers fell in his time.
Yeah.
This is before Enoch. Um, this was such a different world, but it's all part of the spiritual work at play behind the scenes. And we see very clear in the scripture when Daniel was taken captive into Babylon along with the nation. Um, and remember um, that Gabriel came to answer his prayer after 21 days. And he said, "For 1 and 20 days, I came to answer your prayer on the first day, but I was withstood by the prince of Persia for 1 and 20 days."
Mhm.
This gives you some spiritual insight into behind the scenes spiritual battles that's happening, because now you get an insight into the principalities that are over these nations. And this was the prince of Persia. And he said, "Now I've got to go help Michael because I've got to give you this answer, because lo, the prince of Grecia comes." And we know that the next Gentile world empire to come was after the king, or the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold, the chest and the arms of silver was the Medes and the Persians,
Mhm.
and then the belly and the thighs of brass was the kingdom of Greece, which was under the rulership of Alexander the Great.
Mhm.
And then we have the legs of iron, and then we get down to the 10 toes of the iron mixed with clay. So we see that this is what is being specifically talked about, but there are principalities over these nations, principalities over the nations, and these principalities have rulership or authority because they are relegated the uh, over to the evil one.
Yeah.
But God has called out a separate nation for himself. So he relegates those 70 nations over to the enemy. And God says, "I'm taking one for myself, and I'm calling Abram out of this ancient land of Haran where they worship the moon god. And we're going to just play this out. And I'm going to have my guy and my nation, and you're going to have your 70. And let's see what happens here." And this is exactly what we see in Job, where Job is has lost everything, right? And but God says he serves me. The idea is that Job serves God not because he is forced to, but because he wants to.
Yeah.
It was a hard issue.
Right.
So anyway, so there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. If there's anything that you want to tell the audience of why they need to get this book, what would it be?
Only
Jen,
one of
go
its
first.
kind.
Say it again.
It's the only one of its kind. No, but I mean, seriously, I think people need to be thinking about Turkey more. I mean, it's in a lot of ways the Bible begins and literally ends in ancient Turkey, and Aaron and I have more work to do on that topic.
Yeah.
But certainly we won't be. I mean, if you're a history buff, I think you're going to like this book. If you like archaeology and antiquities, I think you're going to like this book. Um, but I think it's going to be an exercise in faith too. I think um, God put Aaron and I together to write this book to bring glory to His name, and to help people, strengthen their faith by looking at this side, and it's related, so it's through the lens of the Bible.
Yes. Anything
Yeah.
you'd like to add, Dr. Allen?
Yeah. If you have an interest in history or archaeology, um, biblical history, Old Testament history, we wanted to give an answer through a biblical lens of what Gobekli Tepe is. And this really crushed all my preconceived notions about Gobekli Tepe. And it took us on a journey of about 5 years. It's well researched. It's heavily footnoted. If you just follow the footnotes
Mhm.
and the references alone, you will get a whole secondary education in this, because we reference not just Christian sources, but secular published sources as well. And so you'll get a whole understanding of not just Gobekli Tepe, but you'll get a clear insight into biblical historicity and how it pertains to us today. Because some person might ask, well, why does that matter for me? Well, at the end of the book, we tell you why it matters. And and um, it, like I said earlier, it's a spiritual battle. And so if we can understand what happened in the very beginning, it can help us understand the spiritual battle that's happening today. And so we just we're excited to be able to get this book out to people. And you may have just heard about Gobekli Tepe but don't know what it is. This is the book for you, because we want to help you with that. And so as you walk through the book and you just read it, we want to encourage you to take notes, to study it, let it be a resource for you. But we want to educate you as well. And as Judd said, we also want to help increase your faith, because it's not a blind faith. There's evidence for our faith, and
Yeah.
the evidence is also coming out in archaeology. And this is exactly where we find Gobekli Tepe.
Wonderfully said. Wonderfully said. Thank you guys so much. Can you let the audience know where they can find your work, where they can find the book, and also support? How can they best support your ministry and what you're doing?
You can find the book. It's live on Amazon. It's trending #1 in 3 categories: archaeology, prehistory, and ancient knowledge. And we would ask that if you love the book, if you would go back to Amazon and write us a stellar review, that would be great. Recommend the book to your friends. Um, you could find my work linked up at aaronjudkins.com. That's AARONJUDKINS, aaronjudkins.com. We have a Patreon site now. If you go to Ancient Pathways, just type in Ancient Pathways at Patreon, that'll pull us up. And we have a lot of free content for free membership for you there. And I just started a Substack account. So if you go to Substack and you just type in my name, Dr. Aaron Judkins, you'll pull up a lot of free content there as well.
All right. What about you, Dr. Judd?
Yeah, people can find my work at burtonbeyond.net, and I'm on Facebook, Twitter, or X rather, YouTube. But yeah, if you like the book, definitely write us a review, because that's going to help us out long run, and get this what we think is an important message out to people, both in the church and out of the church.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we basically wrote this book to people that were just normal everyday people, not specifically, to the church, but just for normal everyday people who were interested in this. And if you have an open mind and love to learn, we would like to put you on a journey with us through this book, and maybe have you consider some things that you haven't considered before.
Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys coming on and taking the time to enlighten us with the Gobekli Tepe and everything that's on this book. We'll have to have you guys back on next time. I had a ton of other questions. I wanted to ask about the T-shaped stones and all that. So we'll get into that maybe next time. But I know that I want to be respectful of your time. So thank you guys. And I want to just thank the listening audience too as well. And be sure to get your hands on this book. All the links will be in the YouTube channel and Rumble and all of that. And go get your hands on the book and write a nice review as well. So thanks again, you guys.
Thank you, Yvette, for having us on.
I'll see you guys next time. Take care.